This is the third and final sermon in this series on surviving life's greatest battles. And I've said this every time. There are some sermon series where it's a series of sermons connected by a common theme, and they each stand alone. And in a way, these sermons stand alone, but if you really want to get the full picture about how you take on life's greatest challenges, you really need to listen to all three of these. And that's why our great technology people, we've got this on, if you go to the website and get either a podcast or a video cast of the first two sermons or either of them if you miss one. The first Sunday, we talked about the importance of being yourself. Saul places his armor on David, and David tries to move around. He says, I can't do it. This isn't me, and he takes it off. David realizes that you're never stronger than when you're being yourself. You're never weaker than when you're trying to be someone else. It's a really important lesson. It's the key to these other two. You've got to get that part right first. Last week, we talked about David's experiences, how facing this battle, he realized that God had been preparing him in ways that he wouldn't have known otherwise. He looked back, and some of you read Malcolm Gladwell's little book, Outliers. It talks about 10,000 hours of experience. David looked back and he said, look, I've been practicing this shot all of my life. Out there in the wilderness, I faced the bear and the lion, and I'm prepared for this moment. And he claimed that for himself. Today, we're going to talk about trusting in God, and this is really a piece that you have to have if you're going to face life's biggest battles, and ultimately you have to be able to trust in God. So reading again from 1 Samuel 17, David said to Saul, your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and whenever a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went after it and struck it down, rescuing the lamb from its mouth. This is the part where he's talking about his own experience as a warrior out there in the wilderness. And if it turned against me, I would catch it by the jaws, strike it down, and kill it. Your servant has killed both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, since he has defied the armies of the living God. Now, there's a subtle switch, but it is an extraordinarily important switch, because looking back, David says, hey, I was pretty good. I was good with a slingshot. I was good in hand-to-hand battle with these animals. But he says there was more to it than that. It was more than me. It was God. David said, the Lord who saved me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will now save me from the hand of this Philistine. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. The first Goliath I remember facing as a young child was the high diving board. I was 10 years old, 55 years ago. The high diving board. I had learned how to swim and had been swimming around. I'd also learned how to dive off the side of the pool. But I'd been watching the older boys climb the high diving board, and I've got to tell you, it just looked too cool to me. I thought, I want to be a diver. It may be that it was just the sheer terror of it that attracted me. I don't know. But for whatever reason, I decided I want to dive off the high diving board. I didn't want to jump off the high diving board. I want to go head first and dive off the high board. So I began to prepare for it. I began to practice a little bit. I thought, before I take on the high board, maybe I ought to take on the low board. And that I thought would be easy. I mean, if you've ever been to a swimming pool, you look out there at the low board, doesn't seem very threatening at all. I remember the first time I went out on the low board, however, and some of you may recall this, and I looked down and I thought, ooh, this is a lot higher than I thought it was, you know. It looked like the longest distance I'd ever seen. In my experience, practicing on the low board was not all that good. I made, as did some of you, quite a few belly flops before I got it right. And I can remember wondering how painful that might be if I were to make a belly flop from up there on the high board. The day came when I screwed up all the courage I could get, and I climbed the ladder to the high board. I'd hoped that I would be the only one doing that, keep the pressure off, but to my dismay, 2 or 3 other boys started climbing the ladder behind me. I stood out on the edge of the high board and I looked down, and I might as well have been looking off the rim of the Grand Canyon. There was no way in which I could have anticipated how far that distance would appear to me at that point. It looked like an infinite distance, and the swimming pool looked like just some great big blue abyss. A big blue abyss, which I was quite sure had the potential of swallowing me up forever. Standing there on the end of the board, I had a tremendous loss of will and courage. I think that I would have gone back and climbed down the board if it had not been for my recollection of a most painful scene I had seen 2 or 3 weeks earlier. A young boy had climbed up there for his first dive off the board. He'd gotten to the end of the board where I was. There were other kids who had climbed the ladder behind him. And when he got to the end of the board, he just simply could not do it. And some of you have witnessed this scene. So he backed down off the board, and he made the other boys climb down off the ladder so that he could descend into what appeared to me would be an absolutely permanent state of disgrace. That was just simply too painful for me. So I stood there on the high board, and in thinking about it, I recognized that my first Goliath was not the diving board. It was my fear. That before I conquered the high board, I would have to conquer my fear. Years later, I would hear Franklin Delano Roosevelt's address to the American people following the attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. And he would say, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And I remembered that and thinking about standing on that diving board, and I understood exactly what he was saying. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Well, this is not in the text. If you read the 17th chapter of 1 Samuel, you don't find this anywhere in the text. We like to write these stories about our heroes and make them as heroic as we possibly can, don't we? But I'm quite sure, as I think you will be if you stop and think about it, that David was also afraid. The text says he was confident, almost boastful, arrogant even. But there's no doubt in my mind that as he stood on the edge of the field of battle, his heart was racing, the adrenaline was pumping, because he knew that once he stepped foot onto that field, somebody was going to die that day. And it could be him. David's first Goliath that he had to conquer was not Goliath. It was his own fear. It was his own fear. And so the question for us today, as we look at life's greatest battles, how do we conquer the first enemy, which is our fear? David shows us how. Let's look at this verse 37 again. He thinks about all the things that he's done. He tries to build confidence in himself. And yet in the last analysis, he remembers what it is that God has done in his life. The Lord, who saved me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, will also save me from the hand of this Philistine. He manages to go forward by looking back and seeing how the presence of God in his life had made all the difference. That's really why we read these Old Testament stories, isn't it? It is a way for us to remember what it is that God has done in our lives, so that we can go forward. Remembering that God was always there, we can then go forward. The Hebrew people are just remarkable, I think, in this sense. You see them doing it over and over again. The Bible is really just, we said this not long ago, the Bible is really just a series of stories that we read over and over and over again because they inform our own lives. And so the Hebrews, the Jewish people, at every point at which they were facing a huge challenge, they would go back and read these stories. For instance, Abraham and Sarah, confident and secure, comfortable out there in their own land, and God comes to them and says, I want you to pick up and I want you to go to a new land. It will be inhabited by enemies. Your lives will be in danger. And they did it. And they would go back and read these stories and they said they did it, but God was always with them. God never abandoned them. They would tell the story about Moses. God sending Moses back to Egypt, said, you know, you've got people back in Egypt. I want you to go to Egypt. I want you to release the Hebrew people who are now captive under Pharaoh. And Moses goes back, and there comes that moment where the Hebrew people are trying to get away, and the Egyptian army has surrounded them, and it looks like they will be wiped out from the pages of history. And suddenly the waters of the Red Sea part. And the Hebrew people look back and they remembered that story. They said, we thought it was going to come to an end, but God was with us. And God is more powerful than we. God saved us once again. And the stories go on and on like that. The Hebrews wandering in the wilderness. There comes a moment when they think they're not going to survive, when they rebel against Moses, and they say, take us back to Egypt. At least we had food and water in Egypt. And yet God says, if you will trust me, one day at a time, I will see to it that you do not die. And the manna came one day at a time. The Hebrews reminding themselves that God was always with them. And then historically, maybe the most interesting story of all. It's called the Babylonian captivity. There came this moment in the history of Israel when the Babylonians swept down and captured them, and the Jews were dispersed all over the world, but most of them went to Babylon. They were captive in Babylon. And if you read this story from purely an historical perspective, it looks like it is the end of Israel. Literally, Israel has been wiped out. The temple has been destroyed. There's this one extraordinary, poignant line in the Old Testament where the Hebrews in Babylon say, we even hung our harps in the trees, for what good would it do to sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? They thought they'd lost their nation. It looked like they lost who they were as a people. And the Hebrews looked back and they said, guess what? Even then, God had not abandoned us. And so one more illustration from the 20th century, maybe the greatest threat to Israel that ever took place. Hitler's gas chambers, 6 million Jews, Auschwitz, Buchenwald. It looked like Israel would be wiped out, but Israel was sustained by the stories that they had told themselves over and over again. The stories of Abraham and Sarah, the stories of Moses and the sea parting, the story of the Babylon captivity. And Israel faced its greatest battle and survived. In order to conquer our fear, we learn to trust in God. And we learn to trust in God by looking back and seeing that God has been trustworthy. There's a saying that I'm really fond of. I want to put it up here on the PowerPoint. One of my favorite people has this with her email signature, so I read it off as one of our staff members. The will of God will never take you where the grace of God will not protect you. You've seen that before, haven't you? A lot of times. And it's a wonderful saying. And I have to tell you that when things are going really, really well, you can look at this saying and you can think, that's absolutely true. What a beautiful saying. But there comes a time in everybody's life when you think about this saying and you say, it's not right. God has finally gone too far with me. God has finally led me to a place where God's will not protect me. I've been there before. Most of you have. And yet, looking back, if you just hang in there, keep on keeping on, muddling through, as the British say, if you hang in there, you come to a moment when you look back and you say, it was absolutely true. God was with me. The will of God did not take me beyond the love and the grace of God in my own life. I hate cancer. I despise cancer. Cancer has wiped out most of my immediate family. 2 of my 4 grandparents and both of my parents. 2/3 of my family have been killed by cancer, and so I don't like it at all. I have a number of friends right now who are struggling, really struggling with tough cancers. And I was thinking about this the other day. In 1994, my mother was diagnosed with cancer. I remember being at the doctor with her. She was 69 years old, and the doctor told her that she had lung cancer. And I remember the doctor, some of you knew my mother, and she was a very kind of petite, very gracious, elegant, and very conservative woman. And the doctor said, "Have you ever smoked cigarettes?" And she said, "No." And he had a real sense of humor because he lightened the moment up a little bit. He said, "What about chewing? Did you ever chew tobacco?" It was just kind of a light moment. I still remember that. But he diagnosed her with cancer. It wasn't a very good prognosis. She lived 2 years. And I can remember I coined a phrase during that time that my mother struggled with cancer. This is it. I said, "All cancer is brain cancer." And the reason is simple. Once you have cancer, or once someone that you love has cancer, it gets into your brain, it gets into your head, and you cannot get it out. I see some of you shaking your heads. You find yourself thinking about cancer all day long. You're held in the grip of fear all day long, all week long. You struggle. And I remember cancer got into my brain. I almost missed a wedding one night. I was 45 minutes late to a wedding one night because all I could think about was my mother's cancer, the fact that it might get her. And finally, a friend of mine said to me, "Don, your greatest power is that you belong to God. The God who created you and the God who will take you back. The most important thing about your life is that you belong to God. And you need to replace what's in your head, your fear of cancer, with your trust in God." It was one of the most powerful things that's ever been said to me. Your greatest power is that you belong to God. You came from God. You will go back to God. It is the most remarkable thing about your life, and it is undeniable. And when you are able to do that, you are able to turn loose of fear and hold on to God. And that is the secret to facing life's greatest battles. 55 years ago, I stood on the edge of the high board and I conquered my fear. I was not absolutely sure that I would not fall to my death. I really wasn't. But I was absolutely sure that I could not fall out of the reach or the grasp of the God who had created me and loved me and would sustain me one way or the other. That's what happened with David, wasn't it? He claimed who he was. I've got to be myself. He claimed all of his experiences and his prowess on the field of battle. But ultimately he stood on the field of battle and he conquered his courage. And he knew that he could not go beyond the reach or the grasp of the one who had created him, loved him, and sustained him. And David walked onto the field of battle to face Goliath, showing us forevermore how to face life's greatest battles. Thanks be to God. Amen.